Even the question of DNA at the 4 bomb sites is not a simple conclusion. In crowded trains and buses with lots of other people, it can be contaminated and rendered useless. There is no unified statement from police on public record that clearly states all 4 bombers were identified at all 4 of the sites by DNA. It is generally assumed that this is the case.
Their body parts are there and people saw them.
Well,
people had them standing next to them and were blown up by them.
I don't think Tony is disputing the fact that 50...
And is briefly mentioned in the official narrative. But beyond this, nobody can be sure, and it definitely shouldn't be left as an assumption. What is the narrative source for the statement? It would be nice to know considering all of the other errors in the report. The majority of media coverage surrounding DNA and 7/7 is about the alleged bombers' links to the flat in Leeds. But A, this doesn't then link them to the blast sites in London, and B, as we've established, the notion of homemade bombs made in a bathtub is highly questionable in itself and goes against initial evidence of military or at least high-grade explosives. In the days following identification of the men as the suspected bombers, Samantha, Jermaine Lindsay's wife, was adamant that her husband could not have been involved. She told the Sun newspaper she wouldn't believe it until they have his DNA. Yet this seems to be contradicted in an interview published by The Times, where she said that on the 14th, they showed me Jamal on CCTV and said his DNA proved he was one of the bombers. The fact that they said they had his DNA could mean that she didn't believe them and wanted them to show it to her. It doesn't prove that they had it, or if they did, that it was from the bomb blasts. Indeed, on the very same day, police told the BBC that DNA identification would take some time. If they had it at that point, why didn't they call a press conference to prevent confusion and speculation? Eventually, it was reported that the DNA sample used to cross-reference Lindsay's alleged remains was taken from the pay and display ticket he had apparently put on his car in Luton Station. Yet, as we've established, contradictions have emerged about the car, and of course no CCTV is conclusive. It was reported that his car had been towed away on the day of the attacks and stayed in a lockup for 5 days. The official narrative says the car had no ticket, so how was the non-existent ticket used to get his DNA? If the car had a ticket, which was subsequently used to find the DNA, why would the car have been towed away? Lindsay was not a suspect immediately after the attacks, and Luton Station policy is to only wheel clamp an unticketed car. So in reality, there is no reason for the towing either. These contradictions have never been addressed, and no official account about his DNA has been given. Would you convict the man based on these sweeping contradictions? According to The Times, police initially had no need for DNA evidence anyway, because they were all carrying personal documents. They said there was enough documentation found on the bodies to lead police to their home addresses. But even if some documentation was found near the unidentifiable decapitated human remains, that doesn't prove those remains are those named on the documentation. Terror expert Steve Park told Sky News that the documents may have been deliberately planted to send police the wrong way. It has never been explained how documentation bearing the bombers' names were found at all 3 blast sites when bodies were blown into tiny pieces. It seems illogical that small pamphlets of paper and plastic cards would have survived such a fiery explosion. Maybe they should build trains out of paper and plastic to prevent future attacks. Even more bizarre, Mohammed Sadiq Khan had property found at 3 different locations, at 2 of the underground explosions and on the number 30 bus. There is no specific word on what this property was or how it was linked to Khan. Why would there be some at 3 different sites, and why would this property have survived 3 different blasts? Statistically, it seems illogical. One explanation is given in the BBC Conspiracy Files programme.
According to court testimony, forensics suggest it's likely the driver's licence wasn't on the bomber's body when the bomb went off. Like other documents recovered from the wreckage naming the bombers, the licence was relatively undamaged. The pattern suggests the bombers dropped them nearby to ensure they would be identified.
This theory still seems odd and is far from closing the case. If the bombers wanted to be identified, wouldn't it have been much easier to write suicide notes claiming they were about to blow up their specific targets, rather than to leave documents that may have just been burnt up in the explosions? Did they know the exact distance to drop them so they would remain intact? It's also not clear where they did leave them. Is nearby on the tracks? That would have been obvious. Did they drop them a few seats down? Wouldn't somebody have said, "Excuse me sir, you've dropped your driver's licence"? Were they thrown out of windows? This would have been obvious to eyewitnesses. Unless the authorities give full disclosure on what documents were found, in what condition, and where they were found, and how they were linked to the bombers, anyone investigating the attacks will simply laugh it off as impossible. Just like when one of the alleged hijackers' passports was found in the rubble of 9/11. It all seems too far-fetched and completely illogical.
The situation that we faced on 7/7 was unprecedented. There had been substantial amount of planning that had gone on beforehand in the way we would initially respond and make sure that actually, if the incidents were to happen in London, which it did, with tragic consequences, that we and other agencies initially responded well. We put in place mechanisms to make sure that lives were saved, we make sure that people were evacuated properly.
On the day of 7/7, a remarkable coincidence occurred in regard to crisis management. Let's have Peter Power explain this coincidence himself.
Issue. Today we were running an exercise for a company, bearing in mind I'm now in the private sector, and we sat everybody down in the city, 1,000 people involved in the whole organisation, but the crisis team, and the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real. And one of the first things is, get that bureau number. When you have a list of people missing, tell them. And it took a long time.
Just to get this right, you were actually working today on an exercise that envisioned virtually this scenario?
Almost precisely. I was up until 2 o'clock this morning because it's our job, my own company, Advisor Consultants. We specialise in helping people to get their crisis management response. How do you jump from slow time thinking to quick time doing? And we chose a scenario with their assistance which is based on a terrorist attack because they're very close to a property occupied by Jewish businessmen. They're in the city, and there are more American banks in the city than there are in the whole of New York. A logical thing to do. And I've still got the...
I was going to say, how extraordinary today must feel for you as it unfolds.
The thing that concerns me is that what are we doing for the thousands of men and women actually who are in London working? And I say that because at 9:30 this morning we were actually running an exercise for over a company of 1,000 people in London based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations that happened this morning. So I still have the hairs on the back of my legs standing upright.
To get this quite straight, you were running an exercise to see how you would cope with this, and it happened while you were running the exercise?
Precisely, and it was about 9:30 this morning. We planned this for a company.
Although Mr. Power found the funny side, many people rightfully did not. Yes, the authorities and private companies need to plan for potential terrorist attacks, but statistically speaking, for Peter Power to be asked to do an exercise for the exact same tube stations for a drill on the exact same day at the exact same time as the real attacks is extremely suspicious. The fact that police had no interest in Mr. Power as a player or dupe in a wider network shows their one-track mind approach to dealing with major attacks, obviously having a predisposed idea that it was Muslim terrorists alone.